Michael, a former Marine seeking solitude. He thought he had only rescued a stray dog. But after the German Shepherd, named Tom, recovered, he began to act strangely. Day after day, Tom would only stare in one fixed direction, deep into the forest, whining with a desperate urgency. He wasn't haunted by his past. He was trying to deliver a message. Trusting his companion, Michael followed him for hours through the Montana wilderness, until they found a forgotten cabin. The door was padlocked from the outside, yet a thin wisp of smoke was rising from the chimney. Someone was trapped inside. What secret was being hidden in that isolated prison? Please, support us by subscribing to the channel. The silence in the mountains of Montana was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that smothered sound and thought alike. For Michael, it was the only medicine that had ever worked. At 35 years old, his tall frame was leaner than it had been in the Marine Corps, but the strength was still there, coiled in the muscles of his arms and back. His short brown hair was beginning to show threads of silver at the temples, and his face, etched with lines of hardship, held a kindness in the eyes that even the horrors of war could not extinguish. He had retreated to this remote cabin, his late grandfather David's final sanctuary, seeking an escape from the ghosts that followed him from the desert sands. Dressed against the biting cold, an old brown leather jacket left unzipped over a plaid flannel shirt, faded blue jeans, and sturdy work boots. Michael moved with a quiet purpose that belied the turmoil within. The cabin was his fortress, a simple structure of dark, weathered logs, nestled among towering pines. He knew nothing of its deeper history, nothing of the memories it held for others. He was unaware that many years ago, this very cabin had served as a beacon of safety, in the memory of a German shepherd named Tom, a loyal companion who had visited this place with his owner, a dear friend of David's. For Michael, it was just a place to be alone, a place where the only sounds were the wind in the trees and the crackle of the fire. 2:45, Scene 2, The Storm and the Knock. Pacing accelerates slightly with the rising tension. The winter had been relentless, burying the landscape under a thick shroud of white. Each day was a simple routine. Chop wood, check the snares, maintain the cabin, and stare into the flames, trying to burn away the images that haunted his sleep. He had come here to forget, to let the silence heal the wounds that no one could see. He had not expected it to be broken. The storm began in the late afternoon, a whisper that quickly grew into a roar. The sky turned a bruised purple-gray, and the wind howled through the valley like a hungry wolf. Snow began to fall, not in gentle flakes, but in a blinding horizontal torrent that erased the world outside his window. Michael secured the shutters, added another log to the roaring fire in the stone hearth, and settled into his grandfather's worn armchair. The cabin groaned under the assault of the blizzard, but it was solid, built by hands that understood the fury of a Montana winter. He closed his eyes, letting the storm's chaos drown out the noise in his head. 3:56, Turning point, the rescue. Pacing becomes urgent and action-oriented. It was hours later, deep in the night, when he first heard it. A faint, desperate scratching at the heavy oak door. At first, he dismissed it. A branch, scraping against the wood. A trick of the wind, but the sound came again, weaker this time, followed by a low, mournful whine that was almost lost in the gale. It was the sound of a living creature. Adrenaline, a familiar and unwelcome companion, surged through him. He grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace, his movements swift and silent. Who or what could be out there in a storm like this? A lost wolf, perhaps? Or a mountain lion, driven by hunger? He moved to the door, listening intently. The scratching had stopped, but he could sense a presence on the other side, a fragile life, fading in the cold. Taking a deep breath, he unlatched the heavy bar securing the door and pulled it inward, just enough to see. A blast of wind and snow rushed into the warm cabin, and there, collapsed on his doorstep, was a dog. It was a magnificent German shepherd, its thick coat, a beautiful mix of gray and white, now matted with ice and what looked alarmingly like blood. The animal was barely breathing, its body half buried in a fresh drift of snow. This powerful form was limp, a testament to a battle lost against the elements, and something far worse. Without a second thought, Michael swung the door wide open. The dog lifted its head weakly, its intelligent eyes meeting his for a brief moment, before its strength gave out completely. This was Tom, a creature driven by the faint, lingering memory of a safe haven from his youth, a desperate, instinctual pilgrimage to the one place he knew might hold salvation. He had made it, but just barely. Michael's training took over. He knelt in the snow, his hands expertly and gently running over the dog's body, checking for the source of the bleeding. He found a deep gash on its flank, and several smaller wounds that looked jagged and unnatural. This was no accident. "Easy, boy. You're safe now," he murmured, his voice rough from disuse. He carefully scooped the large dog into his arms, surprised by its weight, and carried it inside, kicking the door shut against the raging storm. He laid the animal on the thick bearskin rug in front of the fireplace, the warmth of the flames beginning to thaw the ice from its fur. Michael retrieved his old military first aid kit, its contents familiar and reassuring in his hands. He worked with practiced efficiency, cleaning the wounds, applying antiseptic, and skillfully stitching the worst of the gashes. The dog remained unconscious, its breathing shallow but steady. As he worked, Michael felt a connection to this brave animal, a shared understanding of survival, of enduring pain in a world that had turned hostile. The silence of the cabin was no longer empty. It was filled with the quiet rhythm of two souls, one saving the other, bound together by the fury of the storm. 7:33, Scene 4, The Taming and the Clues. Pacing is calm, then shifts to suspicion. The world was born again in silence. The blizzard had exhausted its fury during the night, leaving behind a landscape of pristine sculpted white under a brilliant morning sun. Michael woke on the armchair, a stiff crick in his neck. His first conscious thought was of the dog. He looked toward the bearskin rug, and found two intelligent amber eyes watching him. Tom was awake. He hadn't moved from his spot, but his posture was different. There was an alertness in his gaze, a quiet dignity that defied the suffering he had endured. He was a creature of immense strength, not just of body, but of spirit. "Hey there, boy," he said softly. "Welcome back." Tom's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. He made a low sound in his throat, not a growl, but a soft rumble of acknowledgement. When Michael set down a bowl of fresh water, Tom, slowly, painfully, pushed himself up and drank, his gaze never leaving the man. Later that morning, Michael knew he had to properly tend to the injuries. The work he had done by firelight had been a desperate patch job. "All right, Tom," he said, approaching slowly with his medical kit. "Let's get a better look at you." He knelt beside the dog, who remained still, his eyes following Michael's every move. He seemed to understand that this human was here to help. As Michael wiped away the dried blood around the large gash on the dog's flank, he saw it clearly for the first time. The edges of the wound were clean, too clean. They looked more like a cut, a deliberate slice made by a sharp object. A cold knot formed in Michael's stomach. His suspicion grew as he examined the dog's other injuries. He found what he had missed in the dark, raw, chafed skin encircling both of Tom's front paws, hidden beneath the thick fur. The marks were unmistakable, the kind left by rope or wire pulled tight, a sign of being bound. His hands paused. He had seen marks like these before, on people, in places he tried hard to forget. This dog had not just been injured, it had been restrained. It had been tortured. A quiet rage, cold and sharp, settled over him. This was not the work of nature. This was the calculated cruelty of a human being. He looked at Tom, who met his gaze without flinching, and a wave of profound empathy washed over him. He saw not just an animal, but a fellow survivor, another soldier who had seen the worst of the world and somehow made it through. He finished his work in silence, his movements gentle and precise. 10:33. Scene 5. The Bond and the Call. Pacing is calm, then gradually builds to high urgency. Over the next few days, a quiet routine formed between the two of them. Michael cared for Tom, and Tom, in return, offered his silent companionship. His presence filled the vast, oppressive emptiness of the cabin. Michael found himself talking to the dog, a release from the solitary confinement he had imposed upon himself. Tom was a patient listener. One afternoon, as Michael sat cleaning his rifle, Tom came and rested his great head on Michael's knee. Michael stopped what he was doing and looked down into those amber eyes. He saw a loyalty there that was absolute, a bond forged in the crucible of a snowstorm. They were two broken souls, a man and a dog, who had found each other in the heart of a merciless winter. But as Tom's body healed, something restless began to stir within his spirit. It started suddenly. Michael would catch the dog standing by the large window that faced the dense northern stretch of the forest, his body rigid, his gaze fixed on a point deep within the trees that Michael could not see. Then came the whining. It wasn't the sound of pain, but a low, mournful and deeply urgent noise that vibrated with a strange anxiety. "What is it, boy?" Michael asked. "See a deer out there." Tom didn't acknowledge him. His focus was absolute. He shifted his weight from one paw to another, his body trembling slightly. Michael attributed it to the trauma Tom had endured. He had seen men in his unit stare off into the distance, their minds replaying horrors. The behavior did not subside, it intensified. Tom began to pace, a restless, agitated circuit from the window to the door, and then to Michael, before returning to the window again. The message was becoming clearer. He needed to go out there. He needed Michael to follow. "It's just ghosts, Tom," Michael found himself saying, trying to soothe the agitated animal. And perhaps himself. "They're not real. You're safe here." But as he looked into the dog's eyes, he saw something that wasn't fear. It wasn't the panicked, unfocused look of a tormented memory. It was intelligence. It was purpose. There was a desperate clarity in Tom's gaze, an unwavering conviction that chilled Michael to the bone. This was not a dog lost in the past. This was a dog with a mission in the present. 1351. Scene 6. The pact. Pacing becomes decisive and resolute. The turning point came on a cold, clear afternoon. Michael was sitting at the heavy wooden table when Tom approached. The dog didn't whine or pace. Instead, he stood directly in front of Michael and nudged his hand with his cold, wet nose, a single deliberate push. Michael stopped what he was doing and looked at him. Tom held his gaze for a long moment. Then he turned, walked to the cabin door, and sat, looking back over his shoulder. It was the most direct, unambiguous plea he could have possibly made. In that moment, all of Michael's rationalizations fell away. The instinct that had kept him alive in the most hostile places on earth screamed at him to pay attention. You trust your partner, you listen to the one watching your back. He looked at the proud, resilient animal sitting by the door, and he knew with a certainty that defied all logic that Tom was not haunted. He was calling for help. The sounds he heard were not echoes of the past. They were a cry from the present. Michael slowly put down his knife. He stood up and walked to the closet where he kept his gear. Tom watched him, a low whine of anticipation rumbling in his chest. "Okay, boy," Michael said, his voice quiet but firm. "Okay, you win." He pulled out his heavy-duty winter coat, his pack, and the rifle he kept propped in the corner. He wasn't just going for a walk, he was going on a mission. He did not know what they would find out there, but he knew he could no longer ignore the call. "Show me," Michael said, slinging the rifle over his shoulder. "Show me what has you so worried." Tom rose to his feet, his tail giving a single powerful wag. He stood by the door, his body quivering with a focused, urgent energy, ready to lead the way. 1603. Scene 7. The trek. Pacing is long, relentless and determined. The moment Michael opened the cabin door, the sheer scale of the wilderness seemed to press in on them. The cold was a clean, sharp blade against his skin, and the silence was absolute, broken only by the soft crunch of his boots on the fresh powder. For a moment, the rational part of his mind questioned the sanity of this venture. But then he looked down. Tom stood beside him, not with the frantic energy of before, but with a calm, focused intensity. His breath plumed in the frigid air, and his amber eyes were fixed on the tree line. He was a soldier, ready to lead his patrol. Michael felt his own military instincts take over, pushing aside the last vestiges of uncertainty. Tom gave a soft woof, a quiet command, and then moved. He did not bound into the deep snow, but trotted with a powerful, efficient gait, his strong legs finding purchase where a human would flounder. He was not just running, he was leading. Michael fell into step behind him, his own long-legged stride eating up the ground. They moved as a unit, a man and a dog, against the immense, indifferent wilderness. The path Tom chose was not a path at all. It was a route born of instinct and memory. He led them through dense stands of pine, navigated around massive fallen logs, and tested the air at the edge of frozen streams. Michael watched him, impressed by his intelligence and sureness. The dog moved with a knowledge of this forest that seemed innate, as if he were following a map, invisible to human eyes. The deeper they went, the more difficult the terrain became. They ascended steep, wooded hillsides, descended into shadowed valleys, and through it all, Tom never faltered. He would frequently look back, his amber eyes checking on Michael, a silent gesture of reassurance and partnership. They had been walking for hours. Michael's muscles ached with the strain of moving through the heavy snow, but he pushed on, driven by the dog's unwavering resolve. He was no longer just a man seeking solitude, he was a Marine on a mission again. His trust placed entirely in his point man. "I'm coming, boy," Michael said, his voice a low cloud in the air. The landscape grew wilder. The signs of human presence had vanished completely. They were in the true heart of the mountains now. And still, Tom led on, following the echo of a call that only he could hear. The sun had begun its descent toward the jagged western peaks. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and the cold was now starting to bite with real venom. Michael's legs burned with fatigue. Any lesser animal would have given up hours ago, but Tom pressed on. Just as a sliver of doubt began to creep back into Michael's mind, Tom's behavior changed. He stopped abruptly at the crest of a small hill, his body rigid, his head held high. A low growl rumbled deep in his chest, the first aggressive sound Michael had heard from him. Then, he let out a single sharp bark that cut through the profound silence of the forest. Michael moved up beside him, his hand resting on the cold steel of his rifle. He followed the dog's gaze. And that is when he saw it. Barely visible against the darkening sky, was a thin, almost imperceptible wisp of grey smoke rising from beyond the next stand of ancient pines. It was a sign of life, in a place that felt utterly devoid of it. Tom plunged down the other side of the hill, his pace quickening. Michael followed, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten, replaced by a surge of adrenaline. His tactical training took over, and he moved with caution. The trees thinned, revealing a small, desolate clearing. In its center stood a hunting cabin. If not for that faint curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney, he would have assumed it had been abandoned decades ago. As they drew closer, Michael noticed the snow around the cabin was an undisturbed blanket of white. There were no tracks leading away. Tom's growling grew louder, a continuous menacing rumble. Then Michael saw what had set the dog on edge, what made his own blood run cold. A heavy, rusted chain was wrapped around the door handles, secured by a large, formidable padlock. The smoke meant someone was inside. The lock meant they were a prisoner. "Easy, boy," Michael whispered, placing a hand on Tom's back. But Tom could not be calmed. He lunged forward, scratching frantically at the wooden door, his whines now sharp with desperation. Michael knelt beside the lock. It was old, but it was solid. "Stand back, Tom," he commanded. He gripped his rifle, reversed it, and slammed the heavy stock against the padlock. The sound was a deafening crack in the frozen air. The old metal held. He struck it again. A powerful, focused blow. On the third strike, the rusted metal finally gave way with a sharp snap, and the lock fell into the snow. Michael unwound the heavy chain and let it drop. He took a deep breath, drew the hunting knife from the sheath on his belt, and slowly pushed the door open. It creaked on ancient rusted hinges, revealing an interior shrouded in near darkness. The air that wafted out was stale and frigid, carrying a sickeningly sweet scent of illness and neglect. Tom darted inside without hesitation, his nails clicking on the dusty floorboards. He ran straight through the small main room, toward a partially open door at the back. Michael followed. Michael knelt beside the lock. It was old, but it was solid. The steel was thick, designed to keep things in or out permanently. He scanned the clearing one last time. They were utterly alone. There was no time to hesitate. "Stand back, Tom," he commanded. He gripped his rifle, reversed it, and slammed the heavy stock against the padlock. The sound was a deafening crack in the frozen air. The old metal held. He struck it again, a powerful, focused blow, driven by years of training. The shackle groaned. On the third strike, the rusted metal finally gave way with a sharp snap. and the lock fell into the snow. The scent of hot, friction-worn steel briefly overpowered the cold air. Michael unwound the heavy chain and let it drop. It landed with a dull, heavy thud. He took a deep breath, drew the hunting knife from the sheath on his belt, and slowly pushed the door open. It creaked on ancient, rusted hinges, the sound protesting the sudden invasion. 21:15, Scene 10. Into the gloom. Pacing slows dramatically, emphasizing sensory details and fear. The door revealed an interior shrouded in near darkness. The air that wafted out was stale and frigid, a damp, heavy cold that cut deeper than the outside air. It carried a strange, unnerving combination of scents, mold and rot, the metallic tang of old blood, and a sickeningly sweet odor, like cloying, decaying fruit. Michael paused on the threshold, his eyes straining in the gloom. The small main room was an absolute disaster. Dust lay thick on everything, disturbed only by the trail of a few small rodents. A crude wooden table was overturned, its legs pointing toward the ceiling. The floorboards, warped and uneven, were scattered with refuse, empty tins, old bottles, and the shredded remains of blankets. This wasn't a temporary hiding place. It felt like a site of long-term confinement and profound neglect. Tom darted inside without hesitation, his nails clicking sharply on the dusty floorboards. He was no longer whining, his focus was laser-like. He ran straight through the chaos toward a partially open door at the back, a sliver of weak, artificial light bleeding out from the crack. Tom paused there, giving a single urgent bark, a clear direction. Michael followed. He moved silently, knife low, his eyes scanning the backroom door. Tom pushed the inner door fully open with his nose, and immediately padded inside, his tail giving small, anxious thumps against the wooden frame. Michael slipped in behind him, the space instantly closing in. This was a small, windowless storage room, cold and suffocating. A single dusty oil lamp sat on an upturned crate, casting weak, sputtering light over the scene. The sweet, sickening odor was strongest here. And then, Michael saw her. Huddled in a dark, filthy corner on a thin pile of rags was a woman. She was small, frail, and dressed in layers of heavy, ragged clothing. Her hair, matted and gray, obscured much of her face, but her eyes, wide, terrified, and ancient, flicked up to meet Michael's. She didn't move, she didn't scream. She simply stared, paralyzed by fear and exhaustion. Tom, however, walked straight toward her. He didn't rush. He moved with a gentle, determined patience, his body low to the ground. He reached the woman's side, nudged his head carefully under her trembling arm, and then let out a low, soft whine, the same desperate sound Michael had heard through the blizzard. But this time, it was one of utter relief. The woman's breath hitched, a slow, agonizing sob escaped her chest, and her frozen hands lifted. Her fingers tentatively found Tom's thick fur, clutching him like an anchor. "Oh, my dear, brave boy," she whispered, her voice a dry, raspy thing, the words barely audible. "You made it back. You actually made it back." Michael lowered his knife, the tension draining out of him in a heavy rush. He stood there, the trained Marine, the survivalist, watching this impossible reunion. It wasn't a stray dog. It wasn't a random rescue. Tom hadn't been delivering a message. He had completed an impossible, instinctual pilgrimage back to his owner. The woman looked up at Michael again, her expression shifting from fear to a profound, desperate hope. "He came all this way," she choked out, tears finally streaming down the tracks of dirt on her cheeks. "They locked me in. I thought I was going to die here." Michael took one step forward, kicking a rusted bucket aside. His eyes locked onto the thick, raw marks circling her thin wrists, visible even beneath the heavy cuffs of her coat. He looked down at Tom, the dog whose own wounds had been carved by a sharp blade, whose paws had been rubbed raw by bindings. In that quiet, terrible room, the whole story snapped into focus. The missing owner, the brutal injuries, the padlocked door. This wasn't an abandoned cabin, this was a prison. Michael knew, with the cold certainty of a man who had seen combat, that the mission wasn't over. They had found the prisoner. Now, they had to deal with the jailer.